Chris Watts is a bloodthirsty psychopathic monster who deserves to burn in hell for the rest of his miserable existence. Similarly, Darrell Brooks is also a bloodthirsty psychopathic monster who deserves to burn in hell for the rest of his miserable existence. These are the claims that a lot of people make. A lot of people believe that about both of these two men. This video is about determining whether or not those two feelings are justified. So, this is a comparison between Darrell Brooks and Chris Watts. We're going to do a brief psychological analysis of Darrell Brooks, since we've already done one for Chris Watts. But to begin with, how are these two men similar, other than what people feel about them? Both of these men are called psychopathic monsters by the general public. Both of these men received maximum possible sentences, up to and including multiple consecutive lifelong sentences without the possibility of parole. Both of them are believed to have murdered children, and also both vehemently are despised by nearly the entire internet. So there is quite a bit of comparison to be made. So, Darrell Brooks' psychological analysis, starting with Ocean. Openness to experience. This is likely to be low due to his extremely poor command of the legal concepts, but because we have such limited information about this person, it's really unclear. Conscientiousness, unknown. Extroversion, unknown, because I personally don't have a lot of information. Mostly all the information I have on him is from the trial and from a few statements here and there about how he conducted himself on the outside, not related to the law. So agreeableness is extremely low, as evidenced by his courtroom behavior. Now, to be clear, I don't have really any video of his behavior outside of the court except for the music videos. But I did wait to make this video until after the sentencing phase of this trial, because I wanted to see what his character witnesses would say. In the sentencing, the defendant usually has someone speak on their behalf. I wanted to listen to that, if that happened, to get a more holistic image of who this person was, and that was not very fruitful. So the only real information I have says that it's a very disagreeable person, as evidenced by the courtroom behavior. Neuroticism appears to be high due to lack of regulating negative emotions in court and throughout life. Okay. So if we compare Chris and Darrell on terms of agreeableness, we see that Chris is extremely agreeable, and we see that Darrell is extremely disagreeable. So these are two polar opposites in terms of personality. Relationships. We're going to talk about Darrell Brooks' relationships. By omission, it doesn't appear as though he has had any lasting, authentic relationships with others throughout his life. Again, there's a very limited lack of information, but we don't see any evidence of any strong relationships throughout his life, when we would expect to see some after, I've spent so much time reviewing this trial. His family members appeared for the sentencing hearing virtually, not in person, and I believe that they were the only people in the entire trial that I saw who appeared virtually and not in person, so that's notable. Everyone else was in person. I don't know what the reason behind that was, but I think it's reasonable to at least suspect that is notable. Darrell Brooks Darrell Brooks' family members, his mother and his grandmother, they only talked about Bible verses and their political opinions relating to mental health and the law, which I didn't find to be particularly relevant, because they didn't spend any time talking about who Darrell was, any redeeming qualities about him. All they wanted to say was mental health, mental health, mental health. That wasn't terribly productive, in my opinion. Relationships comparison. Chris's parents appeared in person for the sentencing phase of his, not trial, but of his sentencing. And his mother said many good things about him in Chris's sentencing. Chris maintained a strong relationship with Shanann for 8 years and maintained a relationship with his parents and sister throughout that time. He appeared to regularly and consistently demonstrate a strong paternal bond with his children. Nothing like this can be said of Darrell. Okay. Symptom presentation as to Darrell Brooks. Pattern of consistent criminal conduct stretching to at least age of 18, stretching all the way back to at least age of 18, which is very important for personality disorder. The attack on the parade occurred when he was 39, so we have about 20 years of criminal history that was noted in the trial, going back to, I believe, before year 2000. This was ranging from petty misdemeanors to being found guilty by jury of 76 counts, including 6 counts of first-degree intentional homicide. So we have, anything from speeding tickets to the most serious crime you can commit. Pervasive pattern of threatened and actual physical violence towards others that is pervasive through his entire life, as far back as 18 at the very least. These behaviors directly caused severe catastrophe in his community, to include murder, and an attack on a peaceful Christmas Day parade. Not a Christmas Day parade, but a Christmas parade. We have a thorough lack of empathy towards victims at all times. We also have a pervasive pattern of a total lack of impulse control in the courtroom. So those are the symptoms. I'll go through mice really quick. So maladaptiveness, because he attacked a Christmas parade, maladaptiveness is certainly met. Isolated incident, we have this pervasive pattern of consistent behavior throughout his entire life, so that's met. Confirmation bias, I don't think that really applies here. And extraordinary circumstances, there is no extraordinary circumstance that could possibly justify any of the behavior that he has done, to my knowledge. And I'm sure that there are other examples that also cannot be explained by extraordinary circumstances. So summary, with Darrell Brooks we have an excessive maladaptive inflexible criminality that pervades every aspect of life, and we have total lack of impulse control. So I'm separating it into 2 categories. 1, the criminality, and the total lack of impulse control. Okay, and as we'll get to later, those can be put into one group, or I'm electing to put them into 2 groups, right? So any social personality disorder, ASPD, I would say that there's a 90% chance that any competent mental health professional would diagnose this. That seems pretty obvious. I don't have many doubts about that at all. It's a classic case of a full-blown clinical personality disorder, in my opinion. This is about as bad as it can get. Okay, and I would also bring up the idea of an impulse control disorder. That is when you have a marked impulsivity that extends beyond what would normally be explained by any social personality disorder. So I'm not so much offering this as a possible diagnosis, more so I'm using this to identify that the lack of impulse control is a particularly problematic issue in this case, that it can be explained by ASPD, especially full-blown clinical antisocial personality disorder, but I'm separating this from ASPD because it is so abhorrent, because it is so destructive to the court proceedings. I think it's necessary to take that out of the group and say this is an extremely big issue that should be dealt with in addition to ASPD, because it was so destructive to that trial. So other possibilities that have been named in this case as to Darrell Brooks: bipolar disorder. Not sure what type, because there's type 1, type 2. I would imagine that his mother, I think, brought up bipolar, maybe his grandmother, I don't know. I would imagine that they're talking about type 2. I don't see evidence of type 2. I guess it could be type 1 as well, but I don't think he's ever been hospitalized for manic episodes that are to the extreme that you would associate with type 1. And I don't see any evidence of the mood swings that occur over a period of weeks. I don't have, again, a lot of information on this guy, but I don't have evidence that would support a diagnosis of bipolar. So I'm not inclined to raise that as a possibility. at this point, but I don't have enough information to rule it out either. Some of this behavior can be associated with bipolar, but everything that I've seen is also explainable by ASPD, so I'm not inclined to entertain that at this point unless I get more information. And the other one that a lot of people suggest, narcissistic personality disorder, perhaps, but I don't see evidence of specifically the grandiosity that would be required, that would need to rise beyond what can be explained by full-blown clinical ASPD. So again, clinical full-blown antisocial personality disorder is also associated with a lot of the behaviors that are associated with narcissistic personality disorder. There's a lot of symptom overlap, and what I'm saying is that I don't really see any symptoms that are exclusively held in the NPD camp that we see in Darrell Brooks that isn't also in the ASPD camp. And specifically the grandiosity is the primary component of NPD, and I'm not seeing that really strong grandiosity. I'm not seeing that I'm better than everyone else. We might see it tacitly, but we don't see it overtly in any obvious manner like we do with the other ASPD traits. So back to Chris. Courtroom conduct, comparing them. When we compare their courtroom conduct, they're complete polar opposites. Empathy for victims. This is somewhat unknown as to Chris, but his is likely to be normal, so it's pretty polar opposites, because in the Darrell Brooks trial, he was mocking his victims, and we don't have anything remotely close to that in the Chris Watts case. Pattern of criminality, polar opposites. Chris has no criminal record. Agreeableness, polar opposites, like we discussed before. Impulsivity, polar opposites. Anger control, polar opposites. Social dominance, polar opposites. And general personality features like agreeableness, and just his general demeanor, his general conduct in court and when interacting with authorities is polar opposites again. So there's no comparison to be made here. There isn't remotely close to being enough room inside the diagnosis of ASPD to fit Darrell Brooks and Christopher Watts in it. It would have to be big enough to encompass the entire human race in order to fit both of these men into that category. So, the point of this video is that monsterhood is for the willing only. Darrell Brooks is a monster not because he hit someone at a Christmas parade. Darrell Brooks is a monster because he decided to be a monster every single second afterwards and then up until the end of his sentencing. To call Christopher Watts a monster is utterly reprehensible, not for Chris's sake, but for the sake of victims who were mocked by their attackers. Monsterhood must be reserved for the willing only, for those who partake of it are the worst among us. Do not sanitize their stench. What I mean by that is, you have Christopher Watts over here, and you have Darrell Brooks over here. I'm saying that Darrell Brooks is orders of magnitude more malicious than anything that Christopher Watts has been accused of. So when we say that both of them are monsters who deserve to burn in hell for the rest of their miserable existence, we're sanitizing, we're making Darrell Brooks look better by associating him with people who are orders of magnitude less malicious. Okay? So that's the point of this video. I don't think it's reasonable to call Christopher Watts a monster, because we need to reserve that label for people who actually mock their victims, who represent themselves in court, who, without good reason, who make a mockery of the judicial process, who use their position, use their right to represent themselves in court to interrogate their own victims. Okay? That's who we need to reserve this label for, not people like Chris Watts, who have not demonstrated any marked malice towards their victims. So that's the point of this video. Do not sanitize their filth.